and welcome to Trip the Beltway Fantastic. We've promised you that each week we will be lifting up the rocks in DC to see what's crawling around underneath. And this week we will not disappoint, as we will be lifting up a big rock, the dome of the U.S. Capitol, and seeing, yes, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu swaggering around underneath. Yes, the majority and minority leaders of both the House and Senate, meaning both parties, including Mitch McConnell, Chuck Shumer, Mike Johnson, and Hakeem Jeffries, formally invited the Israeli Prime Minister to deliver a speech to joint members of Congress, an invitation typically bestowed as an honor and usually to make some sort of unifying statement as a body. Ukrainian President Zelensky has made two such addresses in the last year. We don't have a firm date yet as of this podcast recording, but the invitation has drawn a swift rebuke, considering that Israel has been accused by the International Criminal Court of genocide for the killing of thousands of Gazans, withholding of aid and medicine, and systemic attacks on the civilian infrastructure there, like hospitals and places of humanitarian sanctuary. Just last week, the Israelis struck civilian tent encampments in southern Gaza and then called it a tragic mistake when their missiles set off a fatal inferno. Senator Bernie Sanders and Representative Jim McGovern of Massachusetts and supposedly other progressives have vowed to boycott the visit, the second by Netanyahu since 2015. Others, like Democrat Representative Mark Pocan, argue that by boycotting, only staunch Bibi supporters will be left filling the seats. So here to talk about all this are two of my favorite reporters, Matthew Petty, who writes for Reason Magazine, and Connor Echols, who writes with me for Responsible Statecraft. Matt, let's start with you. What do you think of this pending visit of Bibi Netanyahu to Washington? Isn't he getting everything he wants here? Weapons, political cover, and what we will no doubt see as super adulation from the Congress when he comes?
You know, I think there's a kind of funny irony here that a lot of people's framing of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is like the Israelis want security and the Palestinians want dignity, right? And it almost makes it sound like what Palestinians are concerned with is more symbolic stuff, and what Israelis are concerned with is like material goods. But I think over the past 6 months, we've seen almost the opposite happen, where the Palestinian demand has been for a ceasefire and an end to U.S. military aid. And the Israeli demand has been to be, to have the righteousness of their cause affirmed. And I think there's a very intense worry by the Israelis and by the pro-Israel segment of the U.S. Political class, which is most of them, but not unanimous anymore, about Israel losing legitimacy and support. I mean, the ICC warrant, if the warrant application goes through, right, Israel is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. The U.S. is not a signatory to the Rome Statute. So there's no, right, as long as Netanyahu doesn't go to Europe, it won't have any effect on him. But just the very fact that, like, he's being put in the same defendant's dock as Putin was like a very big blow, I think, to the legitimacy of the Israeli cause. And it seems like this invitation is an attempt to shore up that legitimacy. And the fact that they made it bipartisan is a signal that, like, this is, they want to show that there is still some kind of elite consensus in the U.S. in favor of the Israeli war and in favor of the Israeli state. I thought what was very funny was, Chuck Schumer making a speech that was basically calling for Netanyahu to step down a few months ago, in very diplomatic kid glove ways, but still he was basically calling for a change at the top. And now he's personally inviting Netanyahu, and I think it's because a lot of these people don't see the ICC warrant as just an indictment of a particular Israeli politician. They see it as like an unfair attack on the Israeli state, right? They see it as to some degree, it does impugn the legitimacy of the Israeli government, because it's saying, Israel is not credibly investigating these war crimes. That's what, like, right? The whole point of the ICC is when your own justice system can't provide justice, and the U.S. is saying, well, that's not fair, which,
Just to get back to Chuck Schumer for a second. So what do you make of this switch? Because I've noticed that too, and it seemed to come right about the time where Iran was attacking Israel, and the U.S. and other Arab nations came in and used their missile defense systems to thwart the attacks. And then all of a sudden, Israel got a bunch of sympathy from members of Congress who were sort of waffling about the humanitarian cost on the ground there, including Schumer. What do you make of this turnaround? I mean, he literally was saying that we need to have a post-Bibi reality in Israel, and now he's chief guy inviting him here. What do you make of that?
I mean, again, I think it's exactly what it says on the tin. I think these people don't like Netanyahu personally because they think he's bad for Israel, but they still prioritize Israel's well-being and legitimacy. And I think like a lot of these folk, including Biden, have openly said that, like, we don't like Netanyahu, but we love the state of Israel. And so, it's inviting Netanyahu to them is not necessarily propping him up as prime minister. It is, defending legitimacy of the Israeli state against this unfair ICC attack, which I think is also a little bit ridiculous because, like, this stuff is not just defending the state of Israel. There are other Israeli officials who you can invite, like the president, who's mostly a ceremonial role. By inviting Netanyahu, you are giving him political capital. And I think there's something a little bit inconsistent with the I would say, like, the liberal Zionist view of, like, Netanyahu is bad, but we need to support Israel no matter what, because it's almost designed not only to support the Israeli state, but it's like perfectly crafted if you want to keep Netanyahu in power, right? Netanyahu's whole thing is like, I am a big, strong leader, and the Americans keep trying to tie my hands. And then what happens is the Democrats will criticize Netanyahu publicly and then continue to give him support. So it's like, yeah, this is perfectly, if they had actually, criticized him and then backed the criticism up with some kind of personal consequence, then he risks looking weak. And if they don't criticize him at all, then he doesn't have the US as a foil. But this is like perfectly calibrated where he can have a fake fight with Democrats, win it because he's still getting invited to Congress, and Democrats look weak, he looks strong.
So, Connor, all of that tortured logic that I'm sure Democrats are deploying aside, how does this look outside of the Beltway, having him come here at this time?
Yeah, I mean, I think it looks really bad. This whole episode just highlights the pretty insane, like, distance that there is between public views on this conflict and views in Congress, right? Since the very start of this, we've seen both, within the Biden administration and among staffers in Congress, that all of their concerns about the way the war was going, the way the U.S. has been involved in this, have been just ignored consistently. You've got all kinds of fears about speaking out about this issue, and you see why, and that's because they are really committed at the highest levels of Congress to making sure that Israel is supported even when it's doing things that are objectively objectionable by pretty much any group. And we can see that between, the ICC case, the ICJ case, that are both ongoing, and then also just the general international opprobrium that Israel's been seeing. And yeah, again, poll after poll in the US.
Opinion poll in the US too, I was going to say.
Yeah, exactly. No, poll after poll in the US shows that Americans do not want to keep this bear hug going, but Congress is not willing to do anything about it. And I guess what's so shocking is that you've got people like Schumer and you've got people like Jeffries who are breaking with their own president on this, right? This is not what the Biden administration wants right now. I think that's pretty clear. And the idea that they are more willing to do this while the Biden administration is opposed is kind of shocking.
Do we, and what do we have? Do we have evidence that the Biden administration actually opposes the visit? Like, I haven't looked at it that closely. Did they weigh in at all with any comments when this invitation went out?
Matthew, do you know anything there? I haven't seen specifics, but I've seen like stuff in kind of all the like Beltway newsletters and stuff talking about concern among many Democrats that aren't Chuck Schumer and aren't Hakeem Jeffries about this, and a feeling that it would be counterproductive. But the administration has not weighed in on it to my knowledge publicly.
It's going to be pretty interesting to see what tone. I don't know anything about the administration's reaction, but it is going to be pretty interesting to see the tone of that Netanyahu actually takes here, because Biden is also at the moment kind of trying to strong arm the Israelis into a peace agreement. You know, when a lawyer tells his client, like, you've agreed to this. This is what this is the deal you're taking. And the client's like, I don't know. But yeah, I mean, this is like a weird echo of 2015, right? When Obama was signing the nuclear deal with Iran, and Netanyahu objected and Republicans objected. So they invited Netanyahu to basically give a big speech bashing Obama, you know, without informing the administration. And it was taken as, it was a big point of conflict. This is
it still is, from what I understand. Like the two men do not get along. There's no love lost there with the Obama administration and Netanyahu.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, in a big way, that speech was the turning point in Democratic public opinion on Democratic is in the political party, not like our democracy.
Right.
Yeah, because they did see it as like, oh, this is a government that's acting hostile to just interfering, you know, in our politics in hostile ways. In theory, this is different, right? Because the Biden administration is in favor of the Israeli war. You know, they're in favor of a negotiated end to it, but they're still supporting the war effort. Right, where and Biden is a guy who's very made clear, even when he was Obama's vice president, like, I am to the right of Obama, or I don't know if you want to, it's not really a left right, yeah, but I'm more hawkish than Obama. And so in theory, this should not be a point of conflict, but I wouldn't be surprised if Netanyahu came out guns blazing and attacking the administration. And another big dynamic that's different is that, you know, back in 2015 during the Iran nuclear deal negotiations, the extent of Democrats' criticism of Netanyahu is like, you know, the nuclear deal is good for Israel and good for Israeli interests, and we should be on the same page about this. And the kind of, is my phone going off?
I think so.
I'm sorry.
For once, I remember to turn mine off before the show.
Apologies.
It's no big deal.
Yeah, so, you know, back in 2015, the extent of Democratic criticism of Netanyahu was like, he's bad for Israel. And, you know, the people that they would lean on, and this even continued throughout the Trump administration, the people they would lean on would be like, you know, liberal Zionist organizations like J Street, who would, you know, argue for more dovish policy from within the Israeli political spectrum. You know, they would have former Israeli intelligence or military officials who disagreed with Netanyahu's approach. Now, I think, you know, Democrats are a lot more willing to just come out and say, you know, the Israeli government is the problem actor here, especially on like the kind of edge of the party. And I think we're starting to see this on the within the Republican base too, and within the kind of conservative world, media world, although it's much slower to trickle to elected officials. Slower.
Connor, yeah. Well, let me ask you, just to riff off that, Connor, what is your sense about Democrats during the visit? Will they walk out on the speech? Should they walk out on the speech? I know I mentioned McGovern and Sanders. What is your sense of how many Democrats will actually, they're being quoted in the media saying this is not a good deal, but idea rather, but will they boycott or do some other sort of form of protest visibly, or will they just sit there and clap?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the political costs of sitting there and clapping would be fairly high for some of the people in, let's say, the squad, people like that, AOC, you know, people of that ilk would really not want to be seen publicly, you know, standing up and applauding someone who their base views as like basically a genocidal maniac, right? So I think they have to do something. The question is really for me whether that's a boycott or whether that's some form of silent protest, because I really don't expect that they're going to actually do anything to like interfere with the speech. They've been very critical of when Republicans have made comments during large addresses, like the Marjorie Taylor Greene comments during the State of the Union, things like that. Democrats have been very critical of that type of thing, and it would make them look stupid to kind of flip that and to do it themselves. So I think realistically what we're going to end up with is a lot of kind of, pins on jackets that say ceasefire now or something. But I don't expect a ton of very active pushback.
What surprises me about this is that I almost would have expected a joint address to Congress at the beginning of the operations in Gaza. But now that we're heading into 36,000 dead at least, and this is conservative, 60% of them being innocents, so civilians, women and children, it baffles the mind that they would ask him now at this very moment. And I know you don't have an answer for that, but should we expect that there will be big protests outside? What will that look like? I mean, we have a very restive population. I mean, our campuses are if they weren't out for the summer, I'm sure they would be like in flames at this point in terms of like the energy, the protest energy. I can't imagine how Washington, D.C. is going to have to prepare for protests and what they might be doing to crack down on protesters so as to not have a big spectacle outside.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really haven't seen a protest movement like this current one really since the Iraq War, right? It's pretty remarkable the amount of mobilization among young people that we've seen, and even among people of all kinds of different backgrounds. You went to some of these maybe in the early days of this war, and you would see mostly a lot of people of Arab descent or maybe Muslim folks who care more about this issue directly. But I think it's become wide enough that it's pretty inevitable that there's going to be significant protests of this. I think we haven't seen specific things around the organization of it because the date's still not nailed down for the visit. But I think we will see big protests, just like we're expecting to see, a significant protest at the White House this weekend, because I think that the anger is really significant. The question will be, obviously, the Capitol is a very sensitive place to do protests these days. Things have changed a lot in the last few years around that for fairly obvious reasons. And I'll be curious to see kind of how the Capitol Police would react to a protest. My sense is that it would be pretty negative. So there's definitely potential for some unpleasant scenes.
I was speaking to an Israeli liberal journalist who was kind of wondering, like, why is this a big issue in America? Like, I don't get it. Like, basically, why is this like the Iraq War, the Vietnam War protest when it's not American troops? But I think it is a little bit of a delayed reaction where Israel is become, and I think for both its supporters and its opponents, like the symbol of the last 20 years of the U.S. and the Middle East, because to a large extent, this is like Israel is central to the like Abraham Accords vision. Like this is, the crown jewel of like what the U.S. is making the Middle East safe for. And so a lot of Americans see this war, even if there's not American troops on the ground, although the U.S. military is a little bit more intimately involved in this than they let on. Even if there's no American boots on the ground, people, I think, correctly recognize this is the kind of final battle of U.S. foreign policy in the Middle East. This is the accumulative, this is the accumulation of everything else that's happened. And I think that's part of the reason why it's not just, obviously, the Holy Land is significant to a lot of Americans, but I think for a lot of other ones, it's just because this is the sum total of everything else.
Yeah. And to put a finer point on it, something that I've been reporting on throughout this war is, U.S. arms transfer policy towards Israel. There, in a lot of cases, weapons that are going and hitting civilians in Gaza or hitting targets in Gaza start the day potentially in an American facility inside of Israel that they get privileged access to, right? These arms transfers, a lot of people are maybe picturing them all coming from the United States, but that is not the case, right? There are actual American military officials in Israel guarding weapons and giving those weapons directly to the Israeli military that can then go on to use them that same day, right? We're talking about a level of involvement in this war that is extremely direct, and this idea that a lot of people will have that we shouldn't care about this because it's not an American war. I just think is wrong, right? It's just not up to what's actually been happening.
Right. And yeah, you've mentioned the intimate nature of it. And I think people who are starting to pay attention to this issue after October 7th maybe hadn't realized that we had been supporting Israel with $4 billion a year. And that's not aid, that's not development money, that is all military. So we've built the military industrial complex in Israel that is now being used to kill civilians on the ground. And I do think that Americans are waking up to the fact that we're not a neutral observer in any way, shape, or form in this war. I mean, we are intimately involved. And as you said, our bombs are raining down. And so, yes, we don't have boots on the ground, but we might as well have. And as you know, we had built that pier where our military was going to be a force for good, and engage in a surge of humanitarian aid into Gaza. And then that would have put our troops even closer into contact in Gaza. I mean, literally right off the beach. Unfortunately, or fortunately, however we want to look at it, it fell apart. But I think it's also the lack of control. So on one hand, we're funding this and fueling this entire operation. But on the other hand, we're watching the president of the United States all but groveling to Bibi Netanyahu and so desperately trying to avoid criticizing him when asked. Now, Biden doesn't do a lot of press conferences. He just did a very lengthy interview with Time magazine. And when asked deliberately, are the Israelis committing war crimes? Are they deliberately withholding food and aid from the civilian population? Biden, after stumbling and bumbling with his language and words, immediately says everything's Hamas's fault. And it just seems like he can't even talk about this straightforwardly, the president of the United States. And I think a lot of Americans are starting to ask, well, who is he really working for? Is he working for me, the taxpayer, the American, or for another government? Because he seems, and so does his administration, like John Kirby getting up there at the podium at the briefings every day, seem to be representing the Israeli position in this war more than just United States interests.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's like I said, it's exactly what it looks like on the tin. Like Biden has a very emotional. I mean, people will talk about the Israel lobby, and I think that this is like, there are pro-Israel lobbying groups. They don't get money. The donors don't give them money for nothing. They give them money because these groups play a role in the political system. But I think some people underestimate the degree to which, figures like Biden just genuinely believe that, like, Israel is this small nation under attack, that America has like a special historic duty to help, and
right.
there's all these interviews where Biden basically believes that Israelis should do the right thing because it's good for Israel. It's not because it's not because of some moral consideration with Palestinian human rights. It's that this is why his criticism of Netanyahu looks the way it does, because he doesn't believe that, like, killing civilians is bad on moral grounds. He doesn't believe that it's bad because it's creating instability that the U.S. has to clean up. He believes it's bad because, the Israelis are like his son or something, or his most beloved child that need to be protected. And yeah, but it is, and I think you're right that this is also why there's so much backlash. Like when the Saudis were committing like really just horrendous things in Yemen, and the U.S. was funding it and was also directly involved. I probably even more so than in Gaza, or at least more overtly. They had showed some flexibility with criticism, right? Like the line was kind of like, well, the Saudis are unsavory, but we're trying to like nudge them in the right direction, and they're an important ally. And so like, it's just, we're not happy with this issue. And with the Israeli stuff, it's like, they are so emotionally committed to this, they can't show that kind of flexibility.
No.
It's like, not only are we supporting this materially, but you have to think this is a good thing. And even when it's a bad thing, it's not their fault, it's someone else's fault.
Yeah,
Right.
it's interesting because we're morally and strategically so deeply committed to this, right? Like our entire Middle East strategy relies on Israel being the most powerful country in the region, Israel being our closest partner. We're literally not allowed to sell other countries as good of weapons as we sell Israel, right? And it shows just how stupid that strategy is, right?
And
It
just to
shows.
clarify, like this is actually, there's a law called Israel's qualitative military edge. So it's
Right.
not like, oh, we're not allowed to, like they can't politically do it. Like it's written to U.S. law.
Bake in the cake. Yeah.
A funny anecdote about that. I spoke with a former kind of senior official and a senior U.S. official in Cairo who worked on arms transfers, and he talked about how he used to periodically get the Egyptians would ask for a weapon system, knowing that the U.S. wouldn't give it to them, just to watch them squirm, just to mess with them, right? Because they knew that there are these certain things that the Israelis are just going to put the kibosh on. And that's outrageous. That's outrageous that we would allow another country to make those types of decisions about our foreign policy and who we are selling weapons to, who we're having close relationships with. And it's a huge strategic mistake for us to rely entirely on them as the linchpin for our regional strategy.
So before we go, I'd love to talk to you a little bit about the upcoming presidential election. Some people in writing about the Bibi Netanyahu invitation had suggested that Republicans were doing this on purpose because they knew it would drive a wedge in the Democratic Party. And they know that Biden is on the hot seat with many of his constituents in places like Michigan, for example. And the polls are bearing that out. But that doesn't explain Shumer being on this invitation or Hakeem Jeffries, the minority leader in the House. But like, how much of an impact do you think that the war in Gaza, the invitation to Bibi Netanyahu, the continued supplicant nature of this relationship is going to have on Biden's reelection in November?
I mean, people in the beginning, I think there was a lot of people look at this as a lens of like, there's like simple electoral math where, there's many Arabs in Michigan and then plus however many like leftists, and he just loses this. And, these are the people driving the protests, but that's not the only constituents that Biden is having problems with. It just generally, the more this drags on, it generally contributes to a perception that Biden is weak.
Yeah.
And it's funny because the lesson that, or not funny, I mean, we're talking about very serious things, but it's like darkly ironic that the lesson Biden took from Afghanistan was, don't look weak. So don't adopt dovish positions. But
yeah,
that's not, being a dove is not the only way you can look weak. And I think here he's looking weak because first of all, someone who does not follow this closely at all, just sees like there is a war going on. It is continuing to burn on Biden's watch, right? Like what's going on? And the way even if those people might not have a particularly strongly developed idea of the U.S.-Israel relationship, or they're, if Biden had just put the kibosh on this war much earlier, then it would have made him look much better because, oh, there was a crisis and it ended. But instead it's like a crisis
that he can't stop.
And then, if someone follows this a little bit closely, they can understand whether or not they're like, again, whether or not they have a developed view of the U.S.-Israel relationship. They see like Biden telling the Israelis, this war should end soon, please, pretty please. And then the Israelis being like, no. I mean,
and him going, okay.
That makes, even though he's hawkish, he looks weak just because he can't accomplish the thing that he said that he wanted to do ostensibly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think, Connor?
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time knowing for sure. We all have a hard time knowing for sure exactly what impact this will have. Obviously, there's constituencies, specifically in Michigan and some other important states that are pissed, that are really pissed about this, and that I think will not be voting for Biden in the fall, and that's going to hurt them. But I think something that I've heard from organizers and from Democratic strategists that I think is really interesting is that the people that this is frustrating the most are the organizers, are the activists, are the people who go out and make elections happen, right? Elections, I know that there's been a big turn towards social media and things like that, but a lot of it happens at the door knocking level still. A lot of it happens at calling houses and encouraging them. And the type of people who are energized to do that are the exact people that Biden is frustrating right now. So he's losing his army, right? He's losing his ground game. And I think that is going to have potentially even a bigger impact on the election.
That's a great point, Connor, and something to keep an eye on. Well, thank you both Matthew and Connor for joining me on Trip the Beltway. Fantastic, and I hope you'll come back.
Thanks for having me.
Of course, thank you so much.